Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a quick discussion about recommendations and how you recommend things if you do, and have you actually gotten good recommendations by asking for recommendations. I feel like the visuals of this are going to be a little boring, so I might insert some footage of bookstores and the main street in Niagara-on-the-Lake here on the side, so we'll make this a bit of a vloggy thing. I was thinking about this a bit in part because I've seen a couple of people on Twitter lately asking for recommendations, and sometimes the request is very general. So it will be something like, what's your favorite new fantasy series? Or something even more general, like a piece of adult fiction that includes X demographic. And I sometimes answer those questions, and I sometimes don't, because if I know that the person who's posting that question has very different tastes from my own, I'm probably not going to recommend my actual favorite. Whereas sometimes if it's someone I don't know at all, I might answer the question, and the answers that I'm giving might be very obviously things that they wouldn't enjoy for reasons other than whatever they were asking for. And again, if they're asking for something that's so general, what do you do with that? Because when somebody asks, what's a new fantasy series, and there's no other question, do you know what they're looking for? Are they actually asking for an epic fantasy? Or are they open to other subgenres? When someone asks you for something and just asks for something as general as adult fiction with X demographic, what kind of style are they looking for? Also, when something's phrased like that, you kind of assume that they're coming out of reading YA, and does that mean that they're leaning more towards a kind of popular contemporary fiction that would seem most similar to that? I don't know. That's kind of the same problem that I have whenever I see questions and tags that ask you, what book would you recommend to everyone? And I always think there is no book that I would recommend to everyone. And I mentioned this a bit in my last wrap-up where I was talking about Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which I really enjoyed, but I've seen various reviews of various opinions, from completely negative to completely positive and everything in between. And I think a lot of that, all of those opinions are completely understandable, because I think there are elements in there that are going to appeal to people of certain tastes or certain interests more so than they're going to appeal to others. And I think that's very true of even a lot of generally liked popular fiction. So I guess my question is, when someone asks you, recommend me a book with X element, how many follow-up questions do you ask? And which ones do you think are most telling? Or is it just kind of a random mess and you have to hope for the best? I tend to lean towards just hoping for the best, because I know last year I talked a bit about a friend and I exchanged favorite books, and her choice was something that I didn't particularly enjoy but found interesting. It was a book published originally in Hungarian in the 40s that had just relatively recently been translated, and I thought it was interesting, but it wasn't really my thing, and I did have to follow up with her and ask what the appeal was, because the appeal for her was mostly tone, which was interesting to know, and maybe would have changed my view if I'd read it knowing that for her the appeal was the tone and not something else. And on the flip side, I lent her Tracey Lindberg's Birdie, and she still hasn't returned it. And actually, this is one of my Houston friends, and she's visiting at the end of the month, so I should remind her that she still has my book. But I did warn her when I lent her the book that it's non-linear and very depressing, because again, those are things that I don't think people necessarily enjoy. Because I was overthinking this, I went and fell down the Google pit, and I found a 2004 article in the New York Times that talked about asking people follow-up questions of what they enjoy across various media. And I never know how accurate that kind of thing is, because I think that because you enjoy something in one form, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to enjoy it in something else. I've always thought that the kind of example of that, when the original Warren Ellis, Bryan Hitch run of The Authority came out, a lot of people were suggesting that if you wanted to get people into comics, you would suggest that series to people who enjoyed Independence Day. And I'm one of about 5 people, I think, who hated Independence Day. Luckily, I was already reading The Authority, because I, followed it from the old Stormwatch, so it wasn't so much that turned me off, but I did think at the time, if I heard that recommendation, I wouldn't be reading what is one of my favorite series. So I don't kind of buy into that either. But at the same time, what do you do? And how do you talk about that? And I think it gets tricky when you get into tastes, because I think some people who read for plot or character elements don't necessarily talk about the tone and the style to the same extent. I noticed this particularly when Rakesh Satyal's No One Can Pronounce My Name first came out, and a lot of people were talking about that in terms of what it was about and who it was about. And it made me think going into it that it was going to be very similar to Farzana Doctor's 7 Meters of Pavement, and so I was very hyped for this then new book. But reading it, it wasn't actually like 7 Meters of Pavement at all. The tone was very different, the structure was very different. Even the character backgrounds beyond a broader demographic picture were quite different. So I was disappointed in No One Can Pronounce My Name, even though I think it was a perfectly adequate book, and one that I would recommend to book clubs more than recommend to people who enjoyed 7 Meters of Pavement. Even though, if you talk about it purely for this plot character element, it sounds like they are very similar stories. So I don't know. So that was a little rambly, but I thought I'd ask how other people deal with recommendations, both the ones that they get and the ones that they give. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.